Right now, as you watch this video, the United States of America owes $38 trillion. That's 38,000 billion, 38 million millions. A number so large it's almost impossible to comprehend. Let me help you understand this number. If you spent $1 million every single day since the birth of Jesus Christ 2,025 years ago, you still wouldn't have spent $38 trillion. You need to keep spending for another 52,000 years. This debt is growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. Every second that passes, it increases by $95,000. By the time this video ends, America will owe another $2 million. Politicians tell you this is fine. We can manage it. They say, don't worry about the debt. Federal Reserve officials assure you the economy is strong. Financial experts on TV say America will never default. But here's what they're not telling you. The United States government is quietly executing a plan that has been used by empires throughout history when they owe more than they can ever repay. They're not raising taxes to pay it off. They're not cutting spending to balance the budget. They're doing something far more clever and far more dangerous. They're making the debt disappear, not through repayment, through a process most Americans don't understand and the media rarely discusses. It's called monetary debasement. It's called currency devaluation. It's called inflating away the debt. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is monetary policy. This is economics. This is history repeating itself. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how it works, why it's happening right now, and most importantly, what it means for your money, your savings, and your future. Let's start by truly understanding how massive $38 trillion actually is. If you stack $38 trillion in $100 bills, the stack would be 25,845 miles high. That's enough to circle the Earth at the equator, or reach the moon and come halfway back. If you lined up $38 trillion in $1 bills end to end, they would stretch for 3.65 billion miles. That's enough to reach the sun and back 20 times. Now let's break this down to a personal level. The United States has a population of 340 million people. That means the debt per person is $111,764. But not everyone pays taxes. When you look at debt per taxpayer, the number jumps to $306,000. Think about that for a moment. Every American baby born today inherits over $110,000 in debt before taking their first breath, before they learn to walk, before they go to school, before they earn a single dollar. They already owe the equivalent of a house. And this debt isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. In the year 2000, America's national debt was $5.7 trillion, large but manageable. By 2010, it had grown to $13.5 trillion. By 2020, it hit $27 trillion. Today, in 2025, it stands at $38 trillion, and at current rates of growth, by 2030, it will exceed $50 trillion. We are on an exponential curve, and exponential curves don't end well. So how did we get here? How did the richest, most powerful nation in history accumulate $38 trillion in debt? The story begins with the Founding Fathers. For most of American history, the national debt was relatively small and manageable. The founders actually hated debt. Thomas Jefferson wrote, and I quote, "The principle of spending money to be paid by posterity is but swindling futurity on a large scale." Jefferson understood that debt is a burden on future generations. That borrowing today means your children and grandchildren pay tomorrow. Alexander Hamilton, however, had a different view. He argued that some debt was useful, that it established creditworthiness, that it helped build the nation's economy and infrastructure. For the first 150 years of American history, the country followed a simple pattern: borrow during wars, pay back during peacetime, borrow during emergencies, pay back when times improved. The Revolutionary War created $75 million in debt. It was paid off. The Civil War created $0.7 billion in debt. It was paid off. World War I created $25 billion in debt. It was mostly paid off. World War II created $260 billion in debt. And here's where things started to change. Much of this debt was paid down, but not all of it. Then something fundamental shifted in the 1970s and 80s. Ronald Reagan came to office in 1981 promising to cut spending and balance the budget. He gave powerful speeches about fiscal responsibility, about living within our means, about not burdening future generations. And then he did the opposite. During Reagan's presidency, the national debt tripled, from $900 billion to $2.7 trillion. How did this happen? A combination of three factors. First, tax cuts. Reagan slashed tax rates, reducing government revenue. Second, increased military spending. The Cold War arms race required massive defense budgets. Third, political reality. Reagan discovered that cutting popular programs like Social Security and Medicare was political suicide, so spending continued even as revenue fell. This established a pattern that continues to this day, a pattern that every president since Reagan has followed. Politicians promise fiscal responsibility during campaigns. They get elected. They increase spending. They cut taxes or keep them low. The debt grows, and they blame the other party. George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, every single one oversaw massive increases in the national debt, some more than others, but all of them made it worse. By 2008, the debt had reached $10 trillion, twice what it was just 8 years earlier. And then came the financial crisis. The 2008 financial crisis changed everything. On September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers, one of the largest investment banks in America, declared bankruptcy. Within hours, the entire global financial system was on the verge of collapse. Banks stopped lending to each other. Credit markets froze. The stock market crashed. Companies couldn't make payroll. The world was hours away from ATMs running out of cash. The government had a choice: let the system collapse and risk a second Great Depression, or intervene on a scale never seen before. They also know they can't cut spending enough. Social Security and Medicare are politically untouchable. Defense spending is sacred. Interest payments are mandatory. What's left to cut isn't enough to make a dent, and they absolutely know they can't default. A U.S. default would trigger a global depression that would make 2008 look like a minor recession. It would destroy America's creditworthiness forever. It would end the dollar's status as the reserve currency. So they're left with only one option. The same option that every empire in history has chosen when faced with unpayable debts. They're going to inflate the debt away. Let me explain what that means and why you should care deeply about this. Imagine you owe $10,000 and you make $50,000 a year. That debt is manageable, right? You can budget for it. You can pay it down over time. But what if you could change the value of dollars? So that $10,000 becomes worth only $1,000 in real terms? You'd still owe the same number of dollars, but the real value of your debt just dropped by 90%. That's exactly what the U.S. government is doing right now. And they're doing it through three interconnected mechanisms that are hiding in plain sight: the Federal Reserve's printing press, controlled inflation, and the systematic devaluation of the dollar. This isn't theory. This is happening today. And once you understand how it works, you'll see the evidence everywhere. The first tool in the government's debt erasing playbook is the most obvious, but they do call it what it is. They don't say we're printing money because that sounds reckless and irresponsible. Instead, they use a sophisticated, technical-sounding term that most people don't understand: quantitative easing. Here's how quantitative easing actually works, stripped of all the jargon. Step 1. The U.S. Treasury needs to borrow money, so it issues bonds. These are basically IOUs. The Treasury says lend us money and we'll pay you back with interest. Step 2. Normally, investors, foreign governments, pension funds, they buy these bonds. But what happens when there aren't enough buyers? What happens when a government needs to borrow so much money that the market can't absorb all the bonds? That's where step 3 comes in. The Federal Reserve steps in and buys those bonds. The Fed becomes the buyer of last resort. And here's the part that should terrify you. Where does the Federal Reserve get the money to buy trillions of dollars in bonds? They create it out of thin air. Literally, a Federal Reserve employee types numbers into a computer system and new money exists. No printing press needed. No physical currency. Just digital entries in a database. Poof. Trillions of dollars created with a keystroke. Let me give you the actual numbers, because the scale of this is almost unbelievable. Before 2008, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the total value of all the assets it owned, was about $800 billion. This represented over 90 years of the Fed's existence. Then came the financial crisis. From 2008 to 2014, through 3 rounds of quantitative easing that they creatively named QE1, QE2, and QE3, the Fed's balance sheet grew to $4.5 trillion. They more than quintupled their holdings in just 6 years. But that was nothing compared to what was coming. In March of 2020, as COVID hit and the economy shut down, the Federal Reserve went into overdrive. They didn't just open the money spigot. They blasted it wide open like a fire hose. The Fed's balance sheet exploded from $4 trillion to $9 trillion in just 24 months. Let me repeat that because it's so important. In just 2 years, from 2020 to 2022, the Federal Reserve created more money than in the previous 107 years of its existence combined. More than a century of monetary policy doubled in 24 months. Think about the implications of that. When you massively increase the supply of something, what happens to its value? It goes down. This is basic economics, supply and demand. If tomorrow morning the government announced they were giving every single American $1 million, would you be rich? Would you quit your job and retire? Of course not, because within weeks, maybe days, prices would adjust. A gallon of milk that costs $5 today would soon cost $500. A car that costs $30,000 would cost $2 million. A house that costs $100,000 would cost $30 million. Your $1 million would be worthless because everyone has $1 million. The currency itself became worthless. This is inflation. Too much money chasing the few goods. Now, the Fed hasn't given everyone $1 million, so we're not seeing that kind of hyperinflation. But the principle is the same. When you increase the money supply by 125% in 2 years, you are devaluing the currency. You are causing inflation. And here's why this directly benefits the government. In 2008, the government owed $10 trillion. Those dollars were worth more back then because there were fewer of them in circulation. They had higher purchasing power today. In 2025, the government owes $38 trillion. But those dollars are worth less because there are so many more of them floating around in the economy. In real terms, when you adjust for the devaluation of the currency through money printing, the debt hasn't grown as much as it appears on paper. This is the first part of the strategy. Dilute the currency to shrink the real value of the debt. But printing money alone isn't enough. It has to be combined with the second strategy. And this one is even more insidious because most people don't understand they're being taxed. The second strategy is inflation itself. Now, the official narrative from politicians, from the media, from talking heads on financial TV, is that inflation is caused by all sorts of external factors. Supply chain disruptions from COVID, the war in Ukraine affecting food and energy prices, greedy corporations raising prices, worker shortages driving up wages. And sure, these factors can contribute to price increases in specific sectors. But here's the reality that Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, understood and stated clearly. He said, and I quote, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It is always caused by too much money chasing the few goods. The primary cause of sustained, economy-wide inflation is money printing, period. Everything else is secondary or temporary." And here's the critical part. Here's why the government not only tolerates inflation, but actually wants it. Inflation is a hidden tax on savers, and it's a gift to debtors. Let me give you a simple example to illustrate this. Imagine you bought a house 10 years ago. You took out a mortgage for $100,000. Your salary at the time was $50,000 a year. So your debt-to-income ratio is 2 to 1. You owe twice your annual salary. Now, let's say we experience 10 years of significant inflation. Prices rise, and because of that, wages eventually rise too. Your salary doubles to $100,000 a year. But here's the beautiful part if you're a debtor. Your mortgage is still $100,000. That number is fixed. It doesn't change with inflation. So now your debt-to-income ratio is 1 to 1. Your debt stayed exactly the same in dollar terms, but it's now only half as burdensome relative to your income. Inflation made your debt easier to pay. You didn't pay it off. You didn't make extra payments. Inflation did the work for you by raising your income while your debt stayed constant. The United States government benefits from this exact same dynamic, but on a massive scale. In 2008, America's GDP was $14.7 trillion. The debt was $10 trillion. So the debt-to-GDP ratio was about 68%. In 2025, the GDP is approximately $28 trillion. A lot of that growth is simply inflation. Prices went up, so the dollar value of GDP went up. The debt is $38 trillion, so the debt-to-GDP ratio is now 135%. But now imagine 10 more years of 5 to 8% annual inflation. Not hyperinflation, just persistent, elevated inflation that the Fed claims they were working to bring down, but somehow never quite managed to. By 2035, GDP could be $55 trillion, largely inflated by rising prices. The debt might be $50 trillion. Suddenly, the debt-to-GDP ratio is 90%. It improved, not because the debt was paid down, but because inflation boosted the denominator. The debt didn't shrink in dollar terms, but it shrank relative to the size of the economy. This is why governments throughout history have loved inflation. It's a way to reduce debt burdens without anyone explicitly voting for it, without passing a law, without a public debate. It just happens. But here's the part they don't tell you. Here's the hidden cost. You pay for this. The American people pay for this. Inflation is a hidden tax, and it's the most regressive tax there is. It hits the poor and middle class hardest while barely touching the wealthy. When prices rise 8%, but your salary only rises 3%, you just got a 5% pay cut. You're poorer in real terms even though you're making more dollars. When your savings account earns 1% interest, but inflation is 6%, your savings are losing 5% of their value per year. Every year the money sits in the bank, it can buy less and less. Debtors benefit. Like the government, their fixed debts become easier to repay as the currency loses value. Asset owners benefit. The wealthy who own stocks, real estate, businesses, commodities. These assets tend to rise with inflation. If you own a $10 million real estate portfolio and inflation runs at 6% for 5 years, your property might be worth $13 million. You just made $3 million doing absolutely nothing. But who loses? Savers lose. People with cash in the bank. Retirees on fixed incomes. Anyone who saved responsibly and kept money in safe investments like savings accounts or bonds. Wage earners lose. The middle class whose salaries don't keep pace with rising costs. Rents rise faster than incomes, making housing less affordable. They're trying to save for a house, but housing prices inflated faster than they can save. Inflation is a wealth transfer, from the bottom and middle to the top, from savers to debtors, from the responsible to the irresponsible. And it's happening right now. Let me show you the real data from the past 5 years. In 2020, inflation was 1.4% normal, manageable. In 2021, it was 7.0%, the highest in 40 years. In 2022, it was 6.5%, still extremely high. In 2024, it was 2.9%, but that's a lie by omission. Cumulative inflation from 2020 to 2024 is approximately 22%. That means what cost $100 in 2020 now costs $122. If you had $100,000 in savings in 2020, it's lost $22,000 in purchasing power. The government has $28 trillion in debt in 2020, is now worth 22% less in real terms. The government just quietly erased approximately $6 trillion in debt burden. Through inflation, Congress didn't pass a law. In the background, while everyone was distracted by pandemic news, political drama, and whatever crisis dominated the headlines, $6 trillion of debt made easier to manage, and you paid for it through higher prices at the grocery store, at the gas pump, in rent, in healthcare costs. This is the second part of the strategy, and it's already working. But there's a third mechanism, and this one is perhaps the most sophisticated. Most people have never even heard of it. It's called negative real interest rates, and it's the government's stealth weapon for debt erasure. Let me explain what this means. There are two types of interest rates you need to understand. The nominal interest rate is what you see advertised. If a treasury bond pays for percent, that's the nominal rate. The real interest rate is what matters to your actual purchasing power. It's the nominal rate minus inflation. You buy a treasury bond that pays for percent interest. Sounds decent, right? You're earning a return, but inflation is running at 6%. Your real interest rate is for percent minus 6%, which equals negative 2%. What does this mean in practice? You lend the government $100. After 1 year, they give you back $104. You made $4 in interest, but because of 6% inflation, you now need $106 just to buy what $100 bought last year. You lost $1 in real purchasing power. Even though you earn interest, you got poorer. Now you're probably thinking, why would anyone accept this? First, safety. Treasury bonds are considered the safest investment on earth. During times of crisis and uncertainty, people flee to safety even if the returns are negative. They'd rather lose 2% slowly than risk losing 50% in a stock market crash. During the zero interest rate period from 2008 to 2021, there were no good safe alternatives. Everything paid nothing. At least treasuries paid something. Third, institutional requirements. Pension funds, insurance companies, banks, they're often required by law to own a certain percentage of government bonds regardless of the return. Fourth, foreign governments. Countries like China and Japan hold dollars from trade surpluses. They need somewhere to park those dollars. Treasuries are the most liquid, safest option even if the real return is negative. So people keep buying, and the government keeps benefiting. Here's why negative real interest rates are so powerful for erasing debt. Think about that. You borrow money, and instead of it costing you, it benefits you because inflation is erasing the debt faster than interest is accruing. This happened after World War II, and it is how America reduced its debt from 120% of GDP down to 30% over 3 decades. From 1946 to 1975, the U.S. maintained negative real interest rates almost continuously. Inflation averaged 5 to 6% annually. Bond yields were kept at 2 to 3% through financial repression. The U.S. becomes like Japan after their 1990 bubble burst. Massive debt, slow growth, aging population, central bank permanently intervening in markets to keep things from imploding. Quality of life deteriorates gradually, standards fall, but there's no single catastrophic event, just a long, slow grinding down of prosperity. Scenario 3 is controlled hyperinflation. This is the bad scenario. About 35% probability. Debt reaches 60 to 80 trillion by 2030 to 2035. The Fed loses control of inflation, which runs at 10 to 20% annually for several years. The dollar loses 50 to 70% of its purchasing power over 5 to 10 years. Eventually, a forced reset occurs. A new currency is introduced. The wealth gap becomes extreme and possibly socially destabilizing. What would you see? Prices doubling every 3 to 5 years. Wages lag far behind. Your purchasing power collapses. Savings are destroyed. Social Security and Medicare become worthless in real terms even though the nominal benefits might increase. Asset prices explode. Stocks triple or quadruple not because companies are doing better, but because the currency is worth less. Real estate becomes unaffordable for anyone not already wealthy. Gold goes to $5,000 or $10,000 per ounce. Civil unrest becomes likely as people realize they're getting poorer despite working harder. The government might respond with a currency reform, a new digital dollar, a return to some form of gold backing, a devaluation where they announce that old dollars will be exchanged for new dollars at a rate of 10 to 1 or some similar ratio. The historical parallel here is Argentina. Argentina has experienced this cycle repeatedly. Hyperinflation in the 1980s running at 3,000% annually. Currency reform and stabilization in the 1990s. Default on debt and peso collapse in the early 2000s. Inflation returns in the 2010s and 20s. The peso becomes worthless again. Each cycle wipes out the middle class. The wealthy, who own hard assets and keep money in foreign currencies, survive and even profit. The poor receive government handouts in worthless currency that let them barely survive. The middle class, the savers, wage earners, retirees, they get absolutely destroyed. This is the most likely bad scenario, not a sudden collapse, but a controlled demolition of the currency over a decade. Scenario for its currency collapse, the worst case, about 15% probability. Some major crisis triggers a loss of confidence, a war, a default, political chaos. Foreign creditors dump U.S. Treasury bonds en masse. The dollar loses reserve currency status. Hyperinflation exceeds 100% annually. Complete economic collapse possible. Fragmentation or breakup of the United States. What would you see? Prices changing daily. Store shelves empty because the money is worthless and no one wants to accept it. A barter economy emerges. Social breakdown. Violence. Government authority collapses in some regions. The military or police state emerges to maintain order. A new currency and economic system is forced into place. The historical parallel is Weimar Germany in the 1920s. After World War I, Germany owed massive reparations to the Allies. They printed money to pay. At the peak of hyperinflation, prices doubled every 3 days. Workers were paid twice a day and would rush out on lunch break to spend the money before it lost more value. People carried wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. Life savings accumulated over generations became worthless overnight. The social and political consequences were catastrophic. The middle class was destroyed. Extremism flourished. Within a decade, the Nazis rose to power. Could this happen in America? Most experts say no. The U.S. is too large, too powerful. The dollar too entrenched in global finance. But that's what people said about Rome. The big to fail isn't a law of physics. It's wishful thinking. The trigger for scenario 4 could be several things. BRICS nations successfully launching a viable alternative to the dollar. For international trade, a major war, Taiwan, or a Middle Eastern conflict, forcing massive emergency spending. A debt ceiling crisis where the U.S. actually defaults, even briefly. The Federal Reserve completely losing control of inflation expectations. A Social Security or Medicare crisis forcing unlimited money printing to fulfill promises. Low probability, but catastrophic, civilization-altering consequences if it happens. Now, there's one critical factor that could accelerate any of these scenarios, and it's something happening right now on the global stage: de-dollarization, the world abandoning the dollar. Since World War II, the U.S. dollar has been the global reserve currency. This is America's greatest economic advantage and also its greatest vulnerability. Being the reserve currency means international trade is conducted in dollars. Foreign central banks hold dollars as reserves. Oil is priced in dollars, the so-called petrodollar system. And this gives the U.S. the ability to print money without immediately suffering inflation, because those dollars get absorbed by the global economy when the Fed prints $1 trillion. A significant portion of those dollars flow overseas to buy goods, services, and assets in other countries. This exports some of the inflation. Real rates were negative to 3% for 30 years. The government didn't pay off the war debt. They inflated it away while paying negative real returns to bondholders. And it's happening again right now. From 2020 to 2023, we had significant negative real rates. 10-year Treasury yields were around 3 to 3.5%. Inflation was running at 5 to 7%. Real yields were negative to 2.4% for 3 years. The government borrowed trillions of dollars and was paid roughly to 3% annually. In real terms to do so, they issued massive amounts of debt during this period, locking in these negative real rates. This is financial engineering at the national level, and most people don't even know it's happening. Now, you might be wondering, why doesn't the Federal Reserve just keep interest rates low forever? Why did they raise rates in 2022 and 23? If low rates help the government, because the Fed is caught in an impossible dilemma, a trap of their own making. If they raise interest rates significantly, several bad things happen. Inflation comes down, which is good, but the government's interest payments explode. Remember, we're borrowing trillions every year. If interest rates go from 3% to 7%, the cost of that borrowing more than doubles. It could also trigger a recession. Higher rates mean more expensive mortgages, car loans, business loans. Consumer spending falls, companies cut jobs, the economy contracts, and it could crash the stock market. Higher rates make bonds more attractive relative to stocks. Money flows out of equities. Prices fall. Retirement accounts take a hit. On the other hand, if they keep rates low, different bad things happen. Inflation continues destroying purchasing power. The dollar loses value, and there's a risk, small but growing, of inflation spiraling out of control into hyperinflation. The Fed is stuck between inflation and bankruptcy, between a slow crisis and a fast crisis. And right now, they're choosing the slow crisis. They're choosing inflation. Why? Because inflation is quiet. It's gradual. It's complex. Most people don't fully understand it. They see higher prices and blame corporations or supply chains. They don't connect it to monetary policy. But bankruptcy, a government default, that would be immediate, visible, catastrophic, and everyone would know exactly who to blame. So they're choosing the slow death over the fast death. And that brings us to the 3 strategies all working together. Step 1. Print money through quantitative easing. This increases the money supply and weakens the dollar. Allow and even encourage inflation. This makes prices rise and reduces the debt burden in real terms. Step 3. Keep interest rates below inflation. This creates negative real rates, meaning the government profits from borrowing. The result? The $38 trillion debt becomes easier to manage, not through repayment, but through devaluation. The dollar you save today will buy less tomorrow. The debt the government owes in dollars becomes less burdensome as those dollars become worth less. This isn't a new strategy. This is the playbook every empire has used when faced with unpayable debts. Rome debased its silver currency over 100 years, reducing the silver content from 95% down to 5%. The result was hyperinflation and eventual collapse. Weimar Germany after World War I printed money to pay reparations. Inflation got so bad that prices doubled every 3 days. People needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. Life savings became worthless overnight. Zimbabwe in the 2000s printed money to fund government spending. They ended up with $100 trillion bills that couldn't buy a loaf of bread. The currency was abandoned entirely. Venezuela in the 2010s and 20s printed money to fund socialism. They've experienced over 1,000,000% inflation. The economy has collapsed. Millions have fled the country. And now, the United States in the 2020s is walking the same path. We're not at hyperinflation, not yet, maybe never, but we're definitely using inflation to erode debt. The question isn't whether this is happening. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is how far it will go. And that brings us to the most important question of all. What does this mean for you? How do you protect yourself and your family when the government is actively devaluing the currency? What do you do when your dollars are quietly being stolen through inflation? And most importantly, is there any way to stop this, or is the collapse inevitable? If this strategy is real, if the government really is inflating away the debt, we should see clear evidence in the economy. And we do. The evidence is everywhere once you know what to look for. The dollar's purchasing power has been obliterated over time. Since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the U.S. dollar has lost over 97% of its purchasing power. What $1 could buy in 1913 now requires more than $30. Your great-grandparents could buy a nice suit for $10, a car for $500, a house for $3,000. Those same items today, the suit costs $300, the car costs $30,000, the house costs $100,000. Did suits, cars, and houses become 30 times more valuable? No. The dollar became 30 times less valuable. Evidence number 2. The money supply has exploded. Economists track something called M2, which measures the broad money supply. All the currency in circulation plus bank deposits and money market accounts. From 1960 to 2008, M2 grew steadily, but gradually. About 7 to 8% per year on average. Predictable, stable. Then, in 2020 to 2022, it went vertical. Straight up. The chart literally looks like a hockey stick. M2 increased by 40% in just 2 years. The money supply grew faster in 24 months than in the previous 40 years. Evidence number 3. Real wages have been stagnant for 50 years. In 1973, the average hourly wage in America was $4.03. In 2023, the average hourly wage was $28. That looks like massive growth, right? Wages increased 7 times. But when you adjust for inflation, when you account for the fact that the dollar lost most of its value over those 50 years, the real wage, the actual purchasing power, is exactly the same. The average American worker today can buy the same amount of goods and services that the average worker could buy in 1973. Zero real wage growth. All the increases were just keeping pace with inflation. The median home price in 1970 was $23,000. Today, it's $420,000. But wages, as we just established, only kept pace with inflation. They didn't increase 18-fold in real terms, so how can people afford houses? They can't. Not like they used to. In 1970, the median house cost about twice the median household income. Today, it costs about 6 times the median income. Housing became 3 times less affordable relative to wages. This is asset price inflation driven by cheap money, low interest rates, and money printing. Evidence number 5. Gold's price increase. In the year 2000, gold was $300 per ounce. In 2024, gold reached $2,700 per ounce. That's a 9-fold increase. Did gold become more valuable? Did we discover new uses for it? Did it suddenly become rarer? No. Gold is the same element it's always been. It has the same properties, the same supply. What changed was the dollar. The dollar became less valuable. So it takes more dollars to buy the same ounce of gold. Gold didn't go up. The dollar went down. All of this evidence points to the same conclusion. The dollar is being systematically devalued. Inflation is being used as a policy tool. And debt is being erased through currency debasement. So who wins and who loses in this scenario? The winners are clear. The government wins. They inflate away their debt burden. $38 trillion becomes easier to manage as the currency weakens. The ultra-wealthy win. They own assets, stocks, real estate, businesses, commodities. These assets appreciate with inflation. If you own $10 million in assets and inflation runs at 6% for 10 years, your assets are now worth $18 million. You made $8 million doing nothing. Large corporations win. They can borrow cheap money from the Fed's easy monetary policy. They can raise prices faster than wages increase. Their profit margins expand. Existing homeowners with fixed mortgages win. Their debt becomes easier to pay as inflation raises their incomes while their mortgage payment stays the same. But the losers far outnumber the winners. Savers lose. Your cash in the bank loses purchasing power every single year. That money you responsibly saved is worth less and less. Retirees lose. If you're on a fixed income from a pension or Social Security, inflation destroys your standard of living. Your monthly check might increase 2 or 3%, but prices increase 6 or 8%. You fall behind. Wage earners lose. The middle class whose salaries don't keep pace with price increases. You get a 3% raise and think you got ahead, but inflation was 5%, so you actually fell behind. Young people lose. They're trying to save for a house, but housing prices are inflating faster than they can save. The down payment goal keeps moving further away. Renters lose. Rents increase faster than wages, consuming a larger and larger percentage of income. The middle class is being systematically hollowed out, not through some evil conspiracy, but through the predictable mathematical consequences of monetary inflation. And this leads us to the critical question: what happens next? Every civilization has followed this playbook. Excessive borrowing, money printing, currency debasement has ended the same way. They all go through stages. Stage 1, accumulate debt. The government spends beyond its means. Wars, social programs, and crises justify borrowing. Debt grows but seems manageable. Stage 2, money printing begins. Debt becomes the largest service. Through taxes alone, the central bank starts helping by buying government bonds. Money supply increases. Stage 3, inflation accelerates. Too much money chases too few goods. Prices rise across the economy. Government blames external factors, corporations, supply chains, foreign countries, anything except their own policies. Stage 4, loss of confidence. People realize the currency is losing value. Foreign creditors reduce their purchases of government bonds. Capital flight begins. The currency weakens. Stage 5, hyperinflation or collapse. The currency loses most or all of its value. Social chaos, political instability, a reset becomes necessary. New currency, default, or both. Where is America right now in this cycle? We're somewhere between stage 3 and stage 4. Inflation has clearly accelerated. Confidence is beginning to crack, though it hasn't broken yet. Collapse? Not yet, but the trajectory is unmistakable. There are 4 possible scenarios for how this plays out over the next decade. Scenario 1 is the soft landing. This is the best case, but it's also the least likely. Maybe 10% probability. In this scenario, somehow, miraculously, the government gets spending under control. Economic growth outpaces debt growth. Moderate inflation of 3 to 4% continues for years, slowly eroding the debt burden. The dollar weakens gradually, but remains the reserve currency. The debt-to-GDP ratio stabilizes around 140 to 150%. What would you see? A gradual decline in living standards. The wealth gap continues widening. The stock market muddles along without major crashes or gains. Real estate stays expensive. Slow erosion of the middle class over decades. Why is this unlikely? Because it requires political will that simply doesn't exist. Politicians would need to cut Social Security and Medicare. That's political suicide. They need to raise taxes significantly, also political suicide. They need to reduce military spending substantially. Won't happen. They need to balance the budget. Hasn't happened in over 20 years and won't start now. It's theoretically possible, but don't count on it. Scenario 2 is the decade of stagnation. This is more likely, about 40% probability. The debt continues growing to 50 or 60 trillion by 2030. Inflation stays elevated in the 4 to 7% range. Economic growth stagnates at 1 to 2% GDP growth. Interest payments consume 25 to 30% of the federal budget. The government lurches from crisis to crisis, managing each one through Fed intervention. What would you see? Japanification, lost decades of economic growth, persistent inflation eating away purchasing power, stock market volatility, but no sustained gains. The middle class continues shrinking. Wealth inequality increases, social tensions rise. This is the muddle-through scenario, neither collapse nor recovery, just slow decline. But what happens if the world stops using dollars? The signs of de-dollarization are growing. Saudi Arabia, which has priced oil in dollars exclusively since the 1970s, is now considering selling oil in yuan, Chinese currency. This would be a death blow to the petrodollar system. China and Russia are increasingly conducting bilateral trade in their own currencies. Bypassing the dollar entirely, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus new members like Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia are actively discussing creating an alternative reserve currency or payment system. Central banks worldwide are buying gold at record pace, the fastest accumulation in decades, while reducing their dollar reserves. France completed its first liquefied natural gas trade in yuan instead of dollars. More countries are following. If the dollar loses reserve currency status, several things happen very quickly. The U.S. would no longer be able to export inflation. All those trillions of dollars held overseas would come flooding back to America. Domestic inflation would explode as the money supply effectively doubles. Interest rates would skyrocket because foreign demand for treasury bonds would collapse. Why would China or Japan buy bonds? Denominated in a currency that's no longer the global standard, the debt becomes unpayable. The government's interest costs would become completely unsustainable. This would likely trigger scenario 4, the currency collapse scenario. The loss of reserve currency status has historically marked the end of empires. Britain lost it after World War II and ceased being a global superpower. Spain lost it centuries earlier and declined from empire to regional power. America losing reserve status would be a similar inflection point in history. So what can you do? How do you protect yourself and your family regardless of which scenario unfolds? First and most important, get out of cash, or at least minimize your cash holdings. Cash is guaranteed to lose value, even in the best case scenario with just 3% inflation. Your $100,000 becomes worth only $7,000 or $4,000 in real purchasing power after 10 years. Keep 6 to 12 months of expenses in cash for emergencies and immediate needs. Everything else should be moved into assets that preserve value. Second, own hard assets, things that cannot be printed, things with intrinsic value. Real estate is historically one of the best inflation hedges. It provides shelter, a basic human need. It can generate rental income, and if you have a fixed-rate mortgage, that debt gets inflated away. You win. The bank loses. Caution. Prices are already very high in most markets. A recession could cause temporary price drops, but long-term, real estate preserves wealth better than cash. Precious metals, particularly gold and silver. Gold has a 5,000-year track record as money. It cannot be printed or created. Central banks worldwide are buying record amounts. They clearly know something. Target 5 to 15% of your portfolio in gold. Silver has both industrial demand and monetary demand. It's more volatile than gold, but potentially higher upside. Historically, it's undervalued relative to gold. Commodities in general, oil, natural gas, agricultural products, these are essential for the economy. They tend to rise with inflation. You can invest through commodity ETFs or stocks of commodity-producing companies, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. This is controversial, and I'm not saying it's for everyone, but consider this. Bitcoin has a fixed supply, 21 million maximum, ever. It cannot be printed by any government. It's designed specifically as a hedge against currency debasement. It's extremely volatile. It could go to zero if governments ban it or people lose faith. But it could also go to $1 million per coin if it becomes a widely accepted alternative. The fiat currency risk level is very high. Potential reward is very high. Only invest what you can afford to lose completely. 5% of portfolio maximum for most people. Third, own productive assets. Not all stocks are equal during inflation. You want companies with pricing power. companies that can raise prices without losing customers. Good stocks for inflationary times. Energy companies. They produce oil and gas, commodities that rise with inflation. Material producers, mining companies, lumber, industrial metals. These benefit from rising commodity prices. Consumer staples, food producers, household goods. People need these regardless of the economy. Bad stocks for inflation, growth stocks that depend on cheap money and future earnings. Tech companies, especially unprofitable ones valued on potential rather than current cash flow. Highly leveraged. Companies where debt becomes crushing when rates rise. Own your own business if possible. A business provides income that can adjust with inflation. It has tangible value in equipment, inventory, customer relationships, and you control pricing. If your costs go up, you can raise prices. Fourth, reduce debt selectively. Not all debt is bad in an inflationary environment. Good debt is a fixed-rate mortgage. As inflation raises your income, your mortgage payment becomes easier and easier. The bank essentially loses purchasing power. You win. Bad debt is anything variable rate where payments can increase. Credit cards with high interest. Consumer debt for cars and electronics. Pay these off immediately. Keep your mortgage if it's fixed. At low rate, aggressively pay off credit cards and variable debt. Fifth, increase your income. In inflationary times, income growth is critical. If prices rise 8%, but your income only rises 3%, you're falling behind. Develop high-demand skills that command premium pay. Change jobs. People who switch jobs typically get 20 to 30% raises. People who stay at the same company get to 4%. Start a side business or freelance work. Multiple income streams provide security and faster income growth. Negotiate aggressively. Most people are afraid to ask for raises. The worst they can say is no. Your goal is income growth above the inflation rate. Sixth, diversify internationally. Don't keep all your wealth in U.S. dollar-denominated assets. If the dollar collapses, you don't want to collapse with it. Consider foreign stocks. European, Asian, and emerging markets provide exposure to economies not tied to the dollar's fate. Foreign real estate. If you have significant wealth, property in stable countries like Canada, Switzerland, or Singapore. Foreign currencies, the Swiss franc, Singapore dollar, and Norwegian krona are managed more conservatively than the dollar. Foreign bank accounts if you have substantial assets. This is more complex and has reported requirements, but it provides protection. Seventh, build practical skills in community. In a worst-case scenario, money might become worthless temporarily. In that situation, practical skills matter more than financial assets. Learn to grow food, even if just a garden. Basic repairs, plumbing, electrical, carpentry, medical knowledge, first aid, emergency care, self-defense and home security, water purification and food preservation. Build strong community ties. Know your neighbors. Have people you trust. Local food sources, farmers markets, community gardens. In a true collapse scenario, these matter more than money in the bank. Now, you might be wondering, why doesn't the government just FX this? Why don't they stop spending? Why don't they balance the budget and pay down the debt? The answer is simple and depressing. The political incentives are completely broken. Politicians win elections by promising benefits, more Social Security, more Medicare, better schools, stronger military. They win by spending. They lose elections by demanding sacrifice, by cutting programs, by raising taxes, by telling hard truths. The politician who says we need to cut Social Security benefits and raise taxes significantly to balance the budget will lose to the politician who says, "Don't worry, we can afford everything. We'll just manage the debt better." For 40 years, politicians have kicked the can down the road, and it's worked for them personally. They got elected. They got reelected. They retired wealthy. Nothing collapsed during their term. Short term, the next 3 months, reduce bad debt, pay off credit cards completely, consolidate high-interest loans, Start acquiring hard assets even in small amounts. Buy some gold or silver, even just a few $100s to start. Research real estate markets in your area. Consider I-bonds, which are inflation-protected government savings bonds. Diversify your income. Start a side hustle. Develop new marketable skills. Network in your industry, medium term, over the next year. Rebalance your investment portfolio. Reduce cash holdings to just your emergency fund. Increase hard assets, real estate, commodities, precious metals. Carefully select inflation-resistant stocks in energy, materials, and consumer staples. Increase your earning power. Change jobs if you're underpaid. Switching jobs typically yields much higher raises. Start a business if you have an idea and skills. Invest in education and skills that increase your market value. Build resilience. Strengthen community ties. Learn practical skills like gardening, basic repairs, cooking. Improve your health and fitness. Long-term, 5 to 10 years. Position yourself for the reset. Own tangible assets that will survive currency devaluation. Have international diversification. Don't keep everything in dollar-denominated assets. Be debt-free or have only good debt like a fixed mortgage. Stay informed. Watch key economic indicators like inflation, interest rates, dollar strength. Adjust your strategy as the situation evolves. Be ready to act decisively when crisis hits. Opportunities emerge. Those who are prepared can thrive while others panic. Here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in power wants to say out loud. The American middle class as we know it is being systematically dismantled. Not through some evil conspiracy, not through malicious intent, but through mathematical inevitability. Combined with political cowardice, $38 trillion in debt cannot be repaid. It's mathematically impossible. The numbers don't work. It can only be defaulted on, which would be catastrophic and won't happen, or inflated away, which is happening right now. Your dollars will lose value. This is not a maybe. This is not a possibility. This is a certainty. Your standard of living will decline unless you take action to protect yourself. The wealth gap will widen. Those who understand what's happening and position accordingly will be fine, possibly even prosper. Those who don't will watch their purchasing power evaporate. This isn't pessimism. This is math. This is history. This is reality. But here's the hope, and it's important. Individuals can still thrive. Throughout history, during every monetary crisis, some people prospered. The people who owned hard assets instead of currency. The people who understood what was happening while others were confused. The people who positioned themselves correctly before the crisis hit rather than panicking during it. You could be one of them. The information in this video gives you an advantage that 99% of people don't have. Most people don't know this is happening. They see prices going up and blame corporations for greed. They see their savings losing value and think it's bad luck. They see housing becoming unaffordable and blame investors or foreign buyers. They don't understand the real cause, monetary debasement through debt monetization. They'll wake up in 5 or 10 years wondering why they can't afford anything anymore, why their retirement isn't enough, why the American dream seems dead, and they'll never connect it to these monetary policies. They'll blame immigrants or the rich or politicians from the other party. They'll never understand that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department quietly stole their wealth through inflation. But you know, you understand, and knowledge is power, but only if you act on it. The United States government owes $38 trillion. They're not going to pay it back. That option doesn't exist. They're going to make it disappear through the oldest trick in the economic playbook. Print money and cause inflation. Your dollars are being quietly devalued every single day. Your purchasing power is being systematically destroyed. Your savings are being taxed without your consent or even your awareness. This is happening right now, not in some distant future, not hypothetically, today, this moment. The money in your bank account is worth less now than when you started watching this video 30 minutes ago. The question isn't whether this will continue. The evidence is overwhelming. The trajectory is clear. The political will to stop it doesn't exist. The only question is, what are you going to do about it? Will you pretend everything is fine and watch your wealth slowly evaporate like morning mist? Will you hope that somehow the government will fix this despite decades of evidence that they won't? Or will you take action, move into hard assets, reduce bad debt, increase your income, diversify internationally, build skills and community? Position yourself for what's coming instead of being a victim of it. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The same patterns recur. Every empire that printed money to pay debts ended the same way. Rome, Spain, Britain, France, Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. America is not special. The same economic laws apply. The same consequences follow the same actions. The $38 trillion debt will be erased, not through repayment, not through default, but through devaluation, through inflation, through the systematic destruction of the dollar's purchasing power. The only question is whether you'll be on the side that survives it or the side that gets destroyed by it. The choice is yours, but the clock is ticking. Every day you wait, the dollar loses more value. Every month that passes, assets become more expensive. Every year of delay makes it harder to catch up. The best time to prepare for a C. Why would they change a winning strategy? Also consider the timeline mismatch. The average congressional term is to 6 years. The debt crisis timeline is 10 to 20 years. The politician who creates the problem will be retired and living comfortably when it explodes. The politician who tries to fix it takes all the pain now for credit they'll never receive. And finally, systemic capture. The system benefits the wealthy and powerful. Defense contractors profit from military spending. Banks profit from government debt issuance and money printing. Large corporations profit from easy money and cheap loans. The wealthy profit from asset inflation. The people with the power to change things are the exact people benefiting from not changing things. So what would it actually take to fix this? What needs to happen? To solve the debt crisis legitimately would require several things. Cut spending dramatically. Reduce Social Security benefits by raising the retirement age and means testing. Cut Medicare. Through reform and efficiency, reduce the defense budget by 30 to 40%. Eliminate wasteful programs and subsidies. Raise taxes significantly. Higher income taxes, especially on high earners. A wealth tax on net worth over 10 or 50 million. A VAT or consumption tax like Europe has. A carbon tax to address climate change and raise revenue. Reform entitlements structurally. Raise the retirement age to 70 or 75 as life expectancy has increased. Move to private accounts for younger workers. Reduce benefits for wealthy retirees who don't need them. Grow the economy faster. Massive infrastructure investment to improve productivity. Education reform to create a skilled workforce. Immigration reform to bring in high-skilled workers and grow the tax base. Regulatory reform to encourage business growth. This combination would actually work. It would solve the problem. But it requires political courage that doesn't exist, bipartisan cooperation that doesn't exist, public willingness to sacrifice that doesn't exist. So it won't happen. Instead, we'll continue on the current path until crisis forces change. The question is, when does this break? What's the timeline? Short term, the next 2 to 3 years. Expect continued modest inflation in the 3 to 5% range. Debt grows to 42 to 45 trillion. Stock market volatility continues. No major crisis. Probably medium term, 2028 to 2032, that exceeds 50 trillion. Interest payments become the largest single budget item. Inflation potentially reaccelerates. A possible recession triggers crisis. Long term, 2033 to 2040, the Social Security Trust Fund depletes completely. Medicare crisis intensifies. Debt likely reaches 60 to 80 trillion. High probability of a major financial crisis. There are specific inflection points to watch. 2033 to 2035, the Social Security Trust Fund runs out. At that point, benefits must be cut by about 25%, or taxes must be raised dramatically, or the government must print massive amounts of money. Any of those options will be politically and economically devastating. 2030 to 2035. Interest expense crisis. Annual interest payments could hit $2 trillion or more. This crowds out all other spending. The government faces impossible choices, and whenever the dollar loses reserve currency status, this could happen suddenly due to a war, a crisis, or BRICS successfully launching an alternative. It would trigger an immediate and severe crisis. This isn't just an American problem. The whole world is affected. When the U.S. sneezes, the world catches a cold if the dollar collapses or loses reserve status. Here's what happens globally. Europe either sees the euro rise as an alternative reserve currency, which would hurt their exports, or the euro collapses alongside the dollar because European banks hold trillions in U.S. assets. China holds $900 billion in U.S. treasuries. Those become worth much less or worthless. But China could benefit if the yuan becomes the reserve currency. This could trigger conflict over Taiwan as the U.S. becomes weaker. Japan holds $1.2 trillion in U.S. treasuries for them. This would be catastrophic. Their entire economy depends on a stable dollar and exports to America. Emerging markets often have debt denominated in dollars. If the dollar collapses, but their debt is still priced in dollars, those debts become unpayable. Widespread defaults across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Global trade collapses without a stable reserve currency for pricing and settlement. This would cause a depression-level economic contraction worldwide. The entire world economy is built on dollar stability. If the foundation cracks, everything built on it collapses. This is why central banks worldwide cooperate to keep the system alive. Even when it means slow devaluation through inflation, they're choosing managed decline over catastrophic collapse, a controlled burn instead of a wildfire. So can this be stopped? Is there any way out? Theoretically, yes. Countries have stopped hyperinflation before. Argentina did it in the 1990s by pegging their currency to the dollar, implementing massive spending cuts, privatizing state industries, and enforcing strict fiscal discipline. But Argentina is a small country. America is the global financial system. Practically, no. It cannot be stopped. Not with the current political system. Not with the current incentives. Not with the level of debt we have. We are locked into one of the four scenarios I described earlier. The only questions are which one and when. So what should you do right now? This week, immediate actions. Calculate your exposure to this crisis. How much do you have in cash that's losing value? How much in stocks that could crash? How much debt do you have? Build an emergency fund of 6 to 12 months' expenses in cash for immediate crises. Job loss, medical emergency. Start learning about these topics. Read about inflation, research, hard assets. Learn the basics of precious metals investing. The best time to prepare for a crisis is before it happens. Not during, not after. Before. That time is now.